Hi, Martin. Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. Although it's not coming through on my headset, so let me just get that changed.
I guess this is going through your laptop mic, maybe.
Yeah. Let me see. Where do I set this up again?
So in the Zoom tool on the mic, there is an up arrow there, if you can see on the toolbar next to the mic icon. There is an arrow from where you can change the source.
And that should be so much better now.
Yeah.
Much better for me as well. Excellent. I can hear you a lot more clearly.
All right, Martin. So we are live and we have a few minutes to begin. People are still joining. We are live on YouTube as well.
Excellent. No, probably not my first time on YouTube, but the first time directly live on YouTube, I would say.
Oh, wow. That's exciting.
Okay. I have everything I need to hand, I think, which is just me and a voice to talk with.
Yes, absolutely. How's the weather in Melbourne and how are things out there?
Weather-wise, it's actually been a really nice week. Some nice sunny weather for the start of spring here. But yeah, it's still tough going with the COVID lockdowns here at the moment. But hopefully we can start to see some improvement now. We certainly get the numbers coming down in the right direction. So it starts this weekend. There's a small bit of relaxing on the curfew. And then the end of the month would be the next step to hopefully start relaxing things again, but probably not until end of November, I think, actually, is the target for having things properly opening up again. So fingers crossed by then.
Yeah.
Hopefully by that point, just in time for a Data Platform Summit.
Yes, absolutely.
Let me get a little plug in there for you already.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, this year is all virtual, so let's see how it goes.
Yeah, it'll be nice to be that bit more relaxed and not being worried about what's happening on round about me in the community and just enjoy the experience.
Yes. So for today's Geek Talk, are you planning to show any slide or any demo, or are we just talking about concepts?
More talking about things, and if anything comes up that's worthwhile showing a little bit more, then I will just jump into the Azure portal and use that while talking about things. But no, nothing specifically to show everybody. Let's just talk about things and enjoy ourselves.
All right, perfect. Okay, so we are on top of the hour. Let's begin. Hello, everyone. Again, you all must join from different time zones. My name is Amit Bansal. I'm going to be your host for this Geek Talk with Martin Cairney on Azure SQL DB. I guess you already know a bit about Data Platform Geeks and SQL Server Geeks. These are the communities that we run. We do webinars, virtual symposiums, Geek Talks, and of course, a massive Data Platform Summit, which used to happen in India, but now it's online and it is global. And one of the greatest things about the event is it's going to run non-stop, 72 hours, covering all time zones, all nations. Apart from the summit, we have pre-cons and post-cons also, and we are very grateful to have Martin also delivering a pre-con on Azure SQL DB Security. So you can understand what deep dive it will be. You're talking about 8 hours of content related to security. So, and we thought that why not do a Geek Talk with Martin, talk about his class, as well as understand Azure SQL DB Security in the form of a free-flowing discussion with Martin and the opportunity for you to ask questions. So if you are on Zoom, please use the Q&A panel. If you are watching live on YouTube, you can use the chat window. Likewise, if you're watching this live on Facebook, you can use the chat window. But if you are on sqlservergeeks.com/live and you're watching this live on the page there, maybe you can come over to Zoom if you want, because then you get better experience and you can use the Q&A panel of the Zoom. Whichever way comfortable to you, no worries. So with this, Martin, welcome and thanks for joining. Thanks for giving time for the community stuff that we are doing.
Thanks, Amit. Nice to be here. And, I really enjoyed my first time coming across to DPS last year. A really fantastic experience and a great event. It would have been so much nicer to be able to be there in person and deliver this. But next best thing is the virtual world has taken over and given us that opportunity to continue things and grow the audience and allow more people to enjoy the experience, which I'm kind of looking forward to as well.
I take this as a blessing in disguise, because with every in-person event, there are always so many restrictions in terms of finances, in terms of travel restrictions, etc. So DPS going online has opened up a new world of opportunities for so many people who couldn't attend it in person. So it's great. We're enjoying this.
Yeah, it's just the only thing is my passport's feeling a bit lonely this year.
All right, Martin. So for today's topic, Martin, Azure SQL DB. Friends, Martin has been working with SQL Server and, of course, with Azure SQL for many years now. And he is a specialist in this domain. He is also a Microsoft Most Valuable Professional for Data Platform category. He runs communities in Australia and is a very big voice out there. So, Martin, let's talk about the Azure SQL DB Security. But before we get into the topic itself, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience formally? I mean, I just spoke a few words. Yeah.
Sure. As you said, a number of years. I like to now quote it. I started with SQL Server back in the last century. It just adds that little bit extra depth to things there. But yes, all the way through from playing with SQL Server 6.5 and through all the versions since then, and obviously now into Azure with some exciting changes to the platform there. And it's nice to see the changes and to see the way it's developed and be involved with that, and making things so much easier with Azure to get people started. How much simpler than 2 lines of code to have your database up and running, effectively ready there, waiting for you to deploy into. But I guess with that comes all the caveats that doing something as simple as that really doesn't give you anything. It's in a way it's worse than the old bit of going through the installation wizard for the on-premises one and just clicking next in all the boxes. Doing your basic bit into Azure, because
Yes.
it is probably far more publicly available, can be a lot more dangerous. But yeah, so I run a user group with a bit of a twist here in Melbourne as well, that we don't go for much of the deep dive technical knowledge. It's more of a networking event, and also an opportunity for first time speakers to cut their teeth and do it with a lightning talk type session. So it makes things a little bit easier, a little bit more gentle in introduction, and a nice friendly environment to get things going there. And it's been fun running that over the years, and I've now had my first group member who started off giving their first ever presentation at my user group has now gone on to become an MVP herself, which is very exciting for me to know that can come from the community that way and extend things out, and to expand the community to that level and get more people infused into having a go and be able to share their own knowledge and experience.
And very satisfying also with all the efforts.
Absolutely, it was almost more exciting to have Akansha getting her MVP than it was to get my own renewal this year. Yes.
Right, Martin. So let's get started with today's topic, Azure SQL DB Security. My first question to you on behalf of the audience would be, and I'm sure people also will have similar question, is many of us come from SQL Server background, working with SQL Server on-prem for so many years. And when it comes to SQL Server security, we have these concepts around logins, users, roles, and how that gets tied up with Active Directory in a Windows domain and cluster environment. Now, when we think of security in Azure SQL DB, how does all this translate in the cloud world? Are things similar or are they drastically different? Let's begin with that discussion.
So I kind of treat it as having two sides now. One side of it is pretty similar. It's almost exactly the same as that. You're still dealing with, which logins have got access, what roles within the database are they members of, what do they have permissions to do. And a lot of that really hasn't changed. There's some bits where you can look at the different opportunities that the Azure platform gives you in terms of where your original authentication is coming from, and the nice bit around things like the managed service identities, which can simplify some of your security aspects there. But where you now have to pay more attention is really around the platform. So when you're dealing with it on premises, you probably haven't worried so much about what your networking's like, what your perimeter is in your own network environment. What scope is there for anybody to penetrate that and get access to your systems. Whereas as soon as you move to the cloud, all of a sudden that's there, it's public. There is public opportunities to get to your endpoints. And if you haven't considered that and you just leave things with a nice default setup and go, what's the easiest way for me to get access to systems, you potentially are leaving yourself vulnerable to that side of things. And it covers all the cloud platforms. This is not just something in Azure. I recall for a number of years ago for a client, and they were using AWS. And the way that they had put their SQL Server into a VM in AWS, and they hadn't looked at anything securing that in terms of network restrictions around it. So they hadn't put any sort of controls around that. So what I showed them was starting up a new one exactly the same way that they built that, and start showing them the error log in SQL Server, which was immediately full of failed login attempts. So almost immediately from that being there, people had identified that there was a SQL Server in the cloud that was open on the IP address. And it was all sorts of things like, trying to break in with standard names, things like SA with admin, with, sysadmin, and all these sort of login approaches. And, that's literally within minutes of it being there that people are already identifying it. Now, the platform as a service does help to mitigate some of that. There is a bit more restrictions around the perimeters. You've got more obvious control over the firewall access into there. But generally, you'll always want to open up things to Azure services. And I guess a lot of people don't really understand the bit that that's then open to all Azure services everywhere, not just your particular tenant, but everywhere. So with a little bit, I guess, of understanding of how the connection works through the proxy or the direct connections to your specific Azure machines. So where your endpoint is really a virtual location. It's not your actual final endpoint. It redirects onto there. Understanding what that's like with the actual connections then could give somebody within Azure that chance to try and breach things there. And then again, you're trying with what's your potential admin login and password. So again, the scope for brute force type attacks across the whole of Azure there. So it really is something that you need to start looking at. And with the number of data breaches, and particularly there's Verizon release a report each year, and their latest one this year was quoting the number of data breaches that are a result of misconfigured cloud resources was on the increase. So this really is something that needs to come front of mind as you're deploying things, and not just take the easy option of going, 2 clicks and I've got my database there and that's all I need to do. You really need to start planning this from the ground up and look at how are you going to be connecting to it? Where do you really need to connect from? What's your own networking options to get to your SQL Server, and start to protect it around that sort of approach.
Right, Martin. So, Martin, everything that you just talked about, I mean, you gave examples of even AWS, but when it comes to security with Azure SQL DB, that is different from the way we, let's say, in comparison to SQL Server on VM, and now we also have a third offering, which is SQL running as managed instance. So now what's common and what is different amongst these 3 different flavors of SQL on the cloud?
So
from a security perspective.
From a security perspective, your SQL Server on a VM really doesn't change. It's exactly the same, right, because in that scenario, you are already looking at your virtualized network to connect to. You still need to have that network infrastructure. It's not something that sits there and really just, although you can use it that way of having it as your only thing in the cloud, to do it properly, you still need to actually create a virtual network in Azure, create your virtual machine sitting on that. But you do have a number of levels of firewalls around that. You have your network security groups. You then have, your overall, what are you going to allow into Azure itself? How are you going to map that? You still have your Windows machine or your Linux machine. If it's Windows, you're looking at your Windows firewall on that machine as well to help you to restrict the traffic coming into that. To the other extreme with Azure SQL Database, it still has similar concepts, but they are attached to the service itself. So you still have your firewall, so you can still start to set that up and go, what IP addresses are going to be able to connect to this. You have the option to say, does Azure services have permission to connect directly? And what that ultimately is visualized as is an additional firewall rule for the 0.0.0.0 IP address. So again, it's something that's easily visible and easily queryable from your system to see what you've opened up. But you then start to now have some additional approaches to help to secure that. And ultimately, unless you really, really need that external access, where you want to get down to is switching off your public endpoint, so there's nothing there to let people get access to. If you can switch off your public endpoint and switch off the access to Azure services and restrict things that way, you're then getting that very public platform as a service into more of your secured VM type approach, where it is far more locked down in terms of where you can access it from. Now, for you as a DBA, perhaps, that might make things a little bit more awkward. You might go, but I like having my access directly, where I just go, give me my server name.database.windows.net, port 1433 is open up, I just do my login and password and off I go. Yeah, well, you can change that fairly easily, depending upon how you're set up. Just stick a VM into Azure, use different approaches to get into there, so it doesn't have to be opened up in RDP. Use Bastion, for example, as a way to access that. Use the just-in-time access approach onto your VM and use that as a jump box and do your querying from there. And there's lots of ways to reduce your exposure and your footprint. But really the differences are all at that higher level. And it's just now, because it's built into the platform, that you have to be aware of it. You have to understand what you're deploying at that level. So there's a little bit more, I guess, reaching out into that infrastructure side approach for you to look at as well. Once you get further down and once you get to the database level itself, there is no difference. What you've got in your database is pretty much transfer it from one to the other without any issues around that side of things. But again, there's some common approaches that I like to see that when we come to that side of things, and how you actually go about developing your databases and thinking about how you're then going to secure the objects and the data within it. There's some other aspects to start thinking about there as well.
Right. Martin, would you like to show a few things around in the Azure portal?
Let's just we'll do a quick view of how things are set up there, because everyone's going to be reasonably familiar with seeing the portal, but depending upon when the last time they looked at it, some of this, you know, it might look up as being new. So
you have the screen share. Yeah, of course you can.
There we go. Okay,
there we go.
So fairly straightforward bit here, just around what you would get by default when you create a SQL database in Azure. Now you've got that still the concept around the server level, and that being the namespace that can manage your control to however many databases you want to put into there. So they all have that same initial access point. So if I was connecting to this one, I'd be going to ndc sql1.database.windows.net. As we can see, the server name itself is actually here. And do I have Zoom up and running? I do. There we go. So there's our external connection point that will come into all of the databases that are running on this one. Now, to get access to that, the other bit I then need to ensure that I've got is that my firewalls are actually set up to give me permission to get into there. So let's kind of drill down there first of all, and let's see what the firewall settings will start to look like. We've got some new bits that have been introduced into the portal, which used to be something that you could only do through PowerShell. And now this has opened up quite nicely to give us this aspect on here. So the core one that you'll really start looking at is just the IP firewall. You know, what's going to give us the immediate access into the SQL Server to start with. That's the one we would get in there. So we can put our identifier rule, put either a range or a single IP address can go in there, depending upon how you're connecting to things. To do that though, we need to ensure that public access is available. So as long as we haven't switched that off at this point and set it to deny public access, then we're okay with getting access there through just that opening the firewall rule and allowing our client to connect into there as well. There's a bit that I was mentioning about understanding how connections are running. The other bit you'll want to look at, and it's not so much directly related to security, but it is on the connectivity. When you connect to your SQL Server, to that endpoint, normally what you might have is a proxy server that's sitting on the end there, on the boundary. And what that will do is then redirect your request to your actual physical SQL Server instance that's running in Azure. The two options in there, proxy and redirect, really just work out how that traffic keeps going. If you've got the proxy, then every request comes initially to the endpoint. It works out where it needs to go and then redirects that on. On the redirect approach, it'll still take that first of all, take your request and go, which actual server am I going to direct you to? And it needs to be something like that, because with the nature of it and with the multiple copies that Microsoft will keep to get your database up and running and give you the high availability, the physical server that you're addressing to can change over time. You don't know where that's going to be. It might have failed over in the background without you knowing anything about it. That just gives me that way of going, this is how I'm going to get there. Now the redirect will just do that, check on the proxy first of all, and then tell you directly back to the client, here's where you need to go to, and it will then start to do things directly to that address. Now, when Azure SQL Database was first released, that was effectively the only way you could do it. It was through this public endpoint and be able to connect there and opening up your firewall. The extensions that have been added in now is where we've got virtual network endpoints. So we can then say within our address space that's connected to Azure, I can say that this particular VNet, I can tag it for SQL Server and say, I trust the connections coming from there. Anything that's connecting from that virtual network, from that subnet that is looking to connect to SQL Server, I'm going to say it's fine. It's got permission. It can come through there directly as well. Now that still needs the Azure Access available on there. So the final bit that's been released is now the opportunity to create a private endpoint connection. And what that does is it creates effectively a new DNS entry within your Azure network. And what it says is that I only need to connect to this particular subnet, to my endpoint in there, and I don't need to have anything then going directly to my SQL Server. So I'm then going to a private IP address. I can direct my client connections to say, you can go to that private IP address. I can start to look at my network security groups and go, what rules am I allowing between virtual networks? So my client virtual network to my private endpoint virtual network, to the subnets in there, I can restrict that traffic and say, yep, there's my only avenue into my SQL Server that way. And by setting up that private endpoint and being able to then completely remove the public endpoint and the allow access to Azure services, I've really locked down my approach to get into Azure at that point to my database, and I know exactly where all the traffic is coming from, and it has to be coming through that approach, and therefore I have helped to really tie down my security on that. So that's a good starting point from there, and that's some of the stuff that we'll for my session at DPS, we'll dive into that in a lot more detail. We'll start to build through those scenarios and show what can happen at each level, and we'll do some testing of where we stick our clients and how they can access it and what area they can and can't access from. So you'll get to see that all the way through from end to end.
Right, Martin. Thank you for that very quick overview. I know in your class you're going to cover quite in depth, and just want to let the audience know that at Data Platform Virtual Summit we have Martin's Martin, is it a pre-con or a post-con?
Oh, good question. I think I'm on the post-cons actually.
Okay. So yeah, either way, you can go to dataplatformvirtualsummit.com and you can find that out yourself. Multiple classes are scheduled, and the best part is for the community, we are giving out the recordings as well. So apart from attending an 8-hour class live, so this training class is going to be for 8 hours divided into 4 hours each day. That's a good balance for work and personal life. So in virtual mode. And you get all the class recordings, so you can watch them anytime, anywhere, and as many times as you want. And of course, the summit, also we have more than 200 breakout sessions, and we are giving out the class recordings to the delegates absolutely at no extra cost. So that was very quick about dataplatformvirtualsummit.com. My background has a lot of info, the URL stuff there. First release of breakout sessions is also up there. So just visit the website and explore. It has all information. Martin, can you just quickly give us an overview of what are the different modules and things that you are going to cover in your 8-hour class on Azure SQL DB Security?
Sure. So where I was hinting at earlier, talking about those two different approaches. So looking at how the platform itself is secured, and then looking at how the database is secured. That's kind of the approach that I've taken to split it down. So the first part of the session, so the first 4-hour batch, is going to be looking at the things around the platform side here. So some of the bits that we've just looked at in terms of how do I start to make my whole platform secure? What else do I need to add into that as well? The other bit will extend out from there is, as well as having the restrictions on the connectivity, we'll start looking at things like auditing and vulnerability assessments as well. So these are additional bits we can start to hook on. And again, how to secure that. There's no point in just setting an audit up and sending that to a storage account that's completely open for everybody to get in and access to. Because if your malicious actor has access to your network, connects to your database, extracts some data out from there, yes, your auditing might capture that. But if that same person can then go into your audits and go, let me just delete the fact that that ever happened, it's all gone. So again, you've got those bits of how do I control access? What do I need to be thinking about across the whole range there? The second batch, so the second half of the session, I'm going to start looking into some of the bits around securing the data itself within the database. So we will start with that review of just how the performance or the permission structure exists within SQL Server. So when you start with things like logins and users and roles, and then down to permissions and objects, what's there with the built-in roles, what do you apply separately, how does that all work? We'll look into that, and then we'll also look at some of the other tools around protecting your data. So things like data masking, things like encryption, how do they get set up? What do we need to consider for those? And hopefully by combining things together from both sides, you are actually giving yourself a secure platform for your data and limiting that opportunity for anything to be inadvertently released as a breach of your data, and protecting things that way. And certainly, obviously with how things work globally, you may be working for an organization that has customers in the EU, for example, and GDPR obviously puts some great emphasis on the protection of your data there. So making sure that you have something which is very tight around how it's secured, limits your exposure there, means that you're far less likely to ever experience that issue. It's never going to close the door completely, because your application developers will blame them separately for the database side of things, but anything that might be weak on the application side may still let things out. So there's a way of just making sure that things are as tight as possible. So we'll split it that way. So between the platform and securing the data as the two parts to the session.
Thanks, Martin. Thanks for that quick overview. So we have a few questions now from the audience. And the first question that we get from James, it is, I'm new to Azure. I work more on-prem, so I would like to know, are all security features available on-prem and are also available in Azure, like row-level security, dynamic data masking, always encrypted? And does Azure SQL DB offer anything new? So that's a question. And to audience, friends, please use the Q&A panel to ask your questions. People who are on YouTube and Facebook, you can use the chat window. Yes, Martin, over to you.
Excellent. Thanks, James. So yes is the short answer to that. So all of those concepts within SQL Server are common across every single version of SQL Server. So from 2016 SP1, Microsoft made the effort of we're going to have this common programmability surface across every single version of SQL Server. So not only did that drive down from things like Enterprise Edition to Standard Edition to Express Edition, it also went across the way. So all the different flavors of SQL Server. So no matter which type of SQL Server you're dealing with, you can start to look at all of those concepts and ensure that they drop in there. There isn't really anything that sits individually for Azure SQL Database. It's just that some of the bits might be implemented slightly differently. So when you start looking at data classification, for example, how you set that up for Azure is different than you set it up for on-premises. Because on-premises, it drives by the individual instance and the individual server that you're running it on. Whereas for Azure, it's now something that has moved up to the Azure Security Center level and sits at that much higher level across everything. So effectively, you get everything covered through there. The one part that does exist in Azure that you wouldn't get on premises is with Azure Policies. And they're a nice way of ensuring that all of your databases stay within compliance. So if you define that I need to have auditing switched on, for example, for all my SQL databases, you can have an Azure policy which can enforce that. So that if somebody tries to deploy an Azure SQL database that doesn't include auditing, you can actually get it to the level of going, well, I'm not going to allow that deployment to go ahead. So that's some nice stuff that you get extra with Azure that you don't get on premises.
Thanks, Martin. Thanks, James, for the question. The next question is from John, and the question is, What are the, okay, that's quite similar. Okay, but anyway, I'll just ask because I think most part of that you have already answered. What are the built-in security features of Azure SQL DB, and what features do we need to get by some external aid? So maybe the later part of the question is more prevalent here. So what can we get by some external aid?
Yeah, and really by external, the one bit I would really consider on there is things like the Azure Policies. So although it doesn't sit with, it sits across the whole of Azure, so it covers absolutely everything that you can do in Azure. So not specifically to SQL DB, but because it's not part of the SQL DB service, I tend to consider that as being external to the service itself. So that would be one that I would include in there. Other bits, yeah, you can make use of other Azure services. The nice bit, and one of the bits I like is that when you switch on data classification, you get some additional information that's put out in your auditing. And your auditing you can send to something like streaming analytics. So you can have that ongoing, let me constantly look at everything coming through in my audit data and actually go, is anybody who's accessing my sensitive data? Is it from something I've set up? So I could keep a managed database of saying, these are the clients and the IP addresses and the logins that are allowed to access the sensitive data. And if I see something which goes through and the query comes out in the audit of saying, this accessed one of my sensitive columns and it's not from any of that, I could get an immediate notification from that. So I can know within seconds that somebody has accessed a sensitive column that shouldn't have had. And I can make that decision then of, is this potentially a data breach? Is it something I don't know? Is it coming from internal? Is it coming from external? How did it get there? And do I have to shut off access to things? Do I have to take that offline and go, I'm just going to contain this until I understand where it's come from? So having that in your armory is something which I think is really good and strong. And because you've got things easily deployable as services within Azure, that's something that would take a lot of effort to do on premises, but you can do it, very quickly there.
Thank you, Martin. So we have the last question from Jesse. What are the possible protective measures that we can take care with while networking in the context of Azure SQL DB?
So that was a bit that I covered. So when I did the bit of the screen share, so we started looking down there at the firewalls to start with.
Right.
But yeah, you have to look at then where your clients are connecting from. Now, if you've got something like a web application in Azure, that's easy because you know where it's coming from. You can look at, can I set this up with a managed service identity and just give that service identity access to my database, so that only that application then has access because it's the only thing that's registered with that identity in Azure. So it's kind of like an extension of Active Directory in that way to be able to manage that. Looking at then if you're going to install your applications on virtual machines in Azure, again, planning your network, put them in a specific subnet for that application that then you trust that subnet to come through and access to your SQL database, but you don't trust any of the other subnets. So again, you might have that bit of going, let me create my jump box VM in Azure in a dedicated subnet, and then I can allow that subnet access to all of my SQL databases through the virtual network endpoints, and open things out that way. So I've got my management plane in there for my DBAs where they can access to everywhere. And it means I don't have to expose anything on the perimeter. I don't have to open up a public IP address for anything. And that's a good starting point from there. Being able to switch that off is always the first option I would look at to see if there's a way to do that.
Right. And I think, Jesse, maybe you joined a little late, but Martin actually showed a quick few screens on how you are configuring those endpoints, etc. So maybe once you get the recording, you can just, kind of watch that back again. Well, Martin, we do not have any more questions. So thank you very much for taking out time today and, giving your inputs to our audience related to Azure SQL DB Security.
My pleasure, Amit. And hopefully that's encouraged people to sign up and come along and see a little bit more in detail over the whole DTS Summit.
Absolutely. So friends, do log on to dataplatformvirtualsummit.com, explore the summit, explore the sessions that are there, the pre-cons, the post-cons. The website has all the details that you seek for. And the best part, of course, the event is going to run round the clock. I mean, if we take pre-cons and post-cons and combine it together, it's like a 10-day event, so to say. Of course, we're taking a break in between on Sunday, but then otherwise it's running round the clock, covering all nations, and you get all the recordings absolutely free, so to say. So, see you online. Yeah, Martin, you have some comments.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I hope that you're not going to be online on video at the end of it, because you're going to look very, very tired at the end of 10 days of round-the-clock stuff.
Yeah, so maybe that the DPS event is going to be one of my last activities for this year, and then I'm going to switch off and see you in 21. Then maybe, hopefully.
Sounds like a good approach to me.
Yeah, of course. All right, friends. Note of gratitude. Thank you, Martin, and thank you, audience, and hope to see you again soon. We have another session coming today. I'm going to do a lecture and demo. Lecture is less, there's more demo. It's a deep dive demo on extended events part 2. This is the follow-up from the previous week. So if you're someone who's working on extended events, join today. Go to sqlmaestros.com/live. I repeat that again, sqlmaestros.com/live. It's there on the chat window too. See you soon. Thank you. Have a good day. Thanks, Martin. Bye.
Thanks, Amit. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.